I'm Josh Layton, and I'm here with JT Creed. It's December 8th, 2016, and we're here at Bridgewater College in Bridgewater, Virginia. And today we're going to be talking about the NFL's handling of various domestic violence cases filed against players in recent years.
And the three main cases that we're going to be focusing on today are the cases involving Ray Rice, Adrian Peterson, and Josh Brown. Now, to start off this discussion, we're going to be talking about the Ray Rice case, in which Ray Rice had assaulted his then fiance. In this assault, he was actually videoed punching her in the face and actually knocking her unconscious. Now, this video of her being knocked unconscious came out after the original 2-game suspension that the NFL had posed on Ray Rice. The NFL then changed their original suspension to an indefinite suspension, and Ray Rice was cut by his organization, the Baltimore Ravens.
I think something interesting that we have discussed is whether or not the video changes, the act, whether or not it makes it worse what Ray Rice did after the video ensued. Because the thing was that the NFL conducted an investigation and then issued the 2-game suspension, thinking that it was appropriate. And then after TMZ released the video of the actual violence that took place in the elevator, there was a lot of negative criticism towards the NFL for how they handled the suspension of Ray Rice, and the NFL chose to suspend Ray Rice indefinitely, and he was cut from the Baltimore Ravens, who originally expressed statements regarding that they would support Ray Rice in the events in the NFL's investigation.
It seems to be that the NFL had not realized the extent at which this domestic violence had happened. Now, you can argue that every domestic violence case is at a certain extent by itself, and that you do not need a video evidence to express how violent and how wrong these acts are. And it's almost like the NFL didn't really put into perspective how serious of an event this was. That's why they only gave him a 2-game suspension, and then they tried to cover their tracks once the video was released, knowing that if they didn't suspend him for more than two games, then they would definitely catch a lot of backlash.
Yeah, they did. The thing that's important to remember is originally the NFL said that they did not have access to the video released TMZ, and that their claims were that they didn't know the extent of the violence, and that's gotten a lot of criticism. Just the fact that the reason they changed their suspension was because they didn't know the extent of the violence. This is kind of the case that initiated a lot of this controversy in the NFL regarding the issue. It was after this that the NFL, it was August 28, 2014, released. Roger Goodell sent a letter to NFL owners calling for a mandatory minimum 6-game suspension for first offense of domestic violence, and then a lifetime ban for a second offense.
Okay, so I think we kind of tackled the Ray Rice issue, briefly touched on some of the more complex issues that are around that case. But we're going to move on to the Adrian Peterson case to try and wrap this up try to wrap it in as an overall topic. So with the Adrian Peterson case, he was indicted on charges of reckless or negligent injury to a child after disciplining his 4-year-old son with a switch. And for those who do not know, a switch is just a term for a flimsy stick used for usually discipline. Peterson was actually deactivated by the Vikings for the 2nd game of that season right after he had been indicted, and then he was placed on the exempt list by the Minnesota Vikings. Now, after this, Adrian Peterson defended his actions by saying it was just discipline and that it was similar to some of the discipline he had received as a child. Now, the NFL commissioner, Roger Goodell, didn't take very kind to this and ended up suspending him for the rest of the season without pay. Now, Adrian Peterson sent back a comment of backlash talking about the CBA and how it was unfair to him based on prior cases as to how his suspension was. And if you compare it to the Ray Rice suspension, you could argue that his was much, much worse in terms of the suspension for the act.
And it's interesting in terms of this case. With Ray Rice, you have actually the abuser in this case and the victim. Janae Palmer never pressed charges. There was apologies made by Ray Rice for his actions, We know now that trying to return to football, he has advocated against domestic violence, and he has promised if he were to play again, his entire salary would be donated to domestic violence-based charities. In this instance, we have Adrian Peterson, who never really expressed remorse for his actions. Instead, expressed that that was just the way that he was brought up, and that type of discipline would be what he would be trying to instill in his children. In this case, there were images released of the bruises and the marks made to his then 4-year-old son. This is all the same season that both cases took place, Ray Rice and Adrian Peterson. And after this particular case, the NFL kind of released another statement in an effort to enforce the originally proposed 6-game suspension that, again, this case didn't follow.
So going along with that minimum 6-game suspension, we then move to our next case dealing with Josh Brown. And the almost astounding nature of the Josh Brown case is that although Roger Goodell had come out about the minimum 6-game suspension, Josh Brown had been arrested for 4th-degree assault and domestic violence, and he was only suspended for 1 game initially by the league. Now, since then, evidence has come out of proof towards these allegations of domestic violence, and he was then cut by the Giants, and he has not been reinstated into the NFL.
This would be kind of a more interesting case. You have these suspensions of Adrian Peterson, Ray Rice, the Greg Hardy suspension at first, which the NFL was criticized for them being so severe. In this case, you have, it was on, the NFL led an investigation early this season into allegations against Josh Brown for 4th-degree assault, domestic violence of his ex-wife. And the NFL concluded, Roger Goodell concluded that a 1-game suspension would be appropriate. So it's kind of almost a return to how people reacted to the initial suspension of Ray Rice, where you have information supposedly gathered by the NFL, Roger Goodell, and a decision made about a suspension, and then we have a change made to the suspension and criticism for not sticking to policy, for not remaining consistent. I was actually reading an ESPN article that said that it's unfair to Brown for not receiving a fair punishment and then a second chance. And you can apply that to Ray Rice right now. You can say that there wasn't a fair punishment and a second chance. He's no longer playing football. And in this case, Josh Brown is not playing for an NFL team at the moment.
And I think one of the main problems with all of these cases in general and just how the NFL handles all of these topics is the consistency of inconsistency. So if you look at from case to case, the suspensions are completely different. And while you can argue that the actions that took place are different, the policies are the exact same. So if you look from case to case, hardly any of them rise up to what the policy has been set for. And that's, again, I think is one of the biggest problems with how the NFL has handled these recent cases.
Yeah, it's really, these cases are different in some of the specific details, but they all deal with the same issue, domestic violence, and the fact that the NFL has chosen different actions to take, different courses to punish players for these actions. After they've released multiple times statements that they're going to stick to this policy of 6 games, we actually really haven't seen this policy kind of stuck to. There's no commitment to sticking to this policy at all, which has called for a lot of this controversy in NFL right now.
I mean, also, it's almost like we see the NFL as valuing their product on the field over the awareness of domestic violence. They kind of put that at the back burner and they don't want to talk about it. They'd rather focus on football, which is understandable to an extent. But when the NFL affects the minds of so many young people and old people alike, they really do need to address this as an issue and come up with a solution and stick to their policies.
you definitely can see Ray Rice before his suspension was in the bottom half of the league in terms of average yards per carry, and Adrian Peterson, who returned after his suspension to an incredibly successful season, set the second most single-season rushing yards of all time, behind Eric Dickerson. And if you look at Josh Brown, he's a Pro Bowl kicker, but kind of in the NFL, the kicking position is viewed kind of not as big a commodity. So the on-field aspect does definitely come into play, and it really draws attention, as you were saying, to kind of the NFL's priorities. Up until this point, we've seen ad campaigns, we've seen propaganda. We haven't seen the things that make a difference. So it kind of unfortunately speaks to maybe the priorities of the NFL in dealing with issues. We talked a lot about how the NFL has cut down on players, has enforced a lot more on players in terms of things like marijuana, things on the field. Definitely have the policies on those issues have been enforced a lot more than this policy that we've been discussing in domestic violence.
So not only does the NFL put a focus or more effort into suspensions for drug use, they also seem to, as one of the articles we read stated, put a focus on breast cancer awareness and other promotional ideas in which they are making some money off of over domestic violence. You don't see domestic violence colors, I guess, being sold, and you don't see things like that. So it just kind of speaks to the fact that they almost avoid domestic violence as an issue at all costs unless it is presented to them by the media and that they need to address it. And once it gets to that point, it's hard to kind of meet it face to face.
Yeah, it's, to me, at times, anytime domestic violence has come up, it's been reactionary. It's not been preemptive. So even the suspensions, when you look at the longer suspensions of Ray Rice and Josh Brown, you look at what if that video had never been released? Would Ray Rice still be playing? Unfortunately, a lot of this is hinged on media reactions of the public in terms of what the NFL actually does.
It's almost like the NFL doesn't want to actually enforce its own policies unless people almost enforce it for them. Because if the NFL weren't to get a bunch of backlash for not suspending these players, who knows if these players would actually, get the deserved suspensions.
Yeah, it definitely seems the NFL only reacts when there's criticism, and unfortunately, it would seem more appropriate that they would take steps before feeling pressure from the media and from the public.
And that's the thing. I mean, they have taken steps by installing new policies right after events have occurred, but that obviously hasn't helped, as even though they have policies set in place so that when events arise, they don't have to necessarily be reactionary. They have these events, or they have these policies that they are supposed to use for when these assault charges come up. And it just seems like they have not consulted their policies when making certain decisions.
So that's all we have for today. This has been Josh Layton and JT Creed from Bridgewater College discussing domestic violence policies in the NFL.